This episode of the Pivot to Balance podcast is sponsored by Riverside.fm, the leading platform to record studio quality podcasts from anywhere. More than 70,000 other podcasts use Riverside, including myself, Gary Vee, Spotify, even the New York Times. What's amazing about Riverside is that when you're recording a podcast or remote interview, recording is independent of Wi-Fi stability, which is huge because content is recorded locally, which ensures reliable and uncompressed content quality. It is super intuitive and easy to use. Once your recording is done, you'll automatically be able to download separate audio and video tracks and edit your content with a few clicks. If you use social media, you also get magic clips from Riverside, which I love. So if you haven't tried Riverside yet, visit riverside.fm and use my code AK15, which is AKAY15, to start recording studio quality sound and video and get 15% off a membership plan. Once again, it's riverside.fm. Use code AKAY15 to start recording today. Hey, before we dive into this week's episode, if you've been enjoying the show, I'd love your support. Take just 10 seconds to rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps others discover the wisdom and inspiration that I share on the Pivot to Balance podcast. Let's build a community of balance seekers together. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to share the love. Now let's dive into the episode. Hello and welcome to the Pivot to Balance podcast. I'm your host, AK, and I hope you're doing well. In a world that pulls us in a million different directions and with a billion distractions, finding balance can feel like an ambiguous quest. Join me on this podcast as I try to navigate life's twists and turns with mindfulness, purpose, and grace. In each episode, we will dive into topics like self-care, personal growth, mindset shifts by sharing practical insights, stories, and maybe even interviews. Get ready to pivot, to recalibrate, and find your balance. Follow the Pivot to Balance podcast, and I will see you on the other side. In today's episode, we are going to talk about action over planning. And since we're not going to plan a lot of stuff, I'm going to dive right into today's episode. We all love planning. I am a type A personality. I love to-do lists. I love checklists. I love planning things out. I used to be this person that would have a checklist for every single thing. I'm sort of like that person that has her morning routine blocked on her calendar. But what I want to talk about today is why we plan so much, but we never actually do anything to implement these plans. If you are someone that loves planning, first let's talk about the trap of overplanning. Overplanning happens when we're caught in an endless loop of researching, thinking, discussing our plans without ever taking the leap in action. It's like preparing for a journey you never actually take. You're taking all the maps, you're planning all the routes, you're packing your bags, but you don't actually leave your house. I think overplanning stems from this innate need to be perfect, to be able to control everything. But I've realized that it's an illusion. A lot of people say don't tell your plans out loud because you lose the dopamine that you get out of actually achieving these things. I have definitely felt that in a lot of situations. For example, this podcast, I have been planning this podcast for 3 years, and there's nothing to plan. I could have just used my phone to record the podcast, but I planned it for 3 years, and I think a lot of the dopamine went into just planning, that I never actually took the action. So I think it's an illusion of progress, and it also sort of masks the fear of uncertainty, and it also is like you're in your comfort zone, right? So there's no risk of failure. And it makes you feel good. So this is definitely a trap. It's leading you to hide from real progress. You know, it becomes inflexible at a point when you have unexpected changes and you're overthinking. This is definitely a trap, right? Because what happens is you get into this whole thing of paralysis by analysis. I am just not someone that loves to start something and then not see it through. But I know a lot of people that start something, but then they don't see it through. And in most cases, from what I have noticed, is it's always paralysis by analysis. We're constantly overthinking. We're constantly trying to make it perfect. This podcast might not be perfect to me when I listen to it 3 years from now because I would have had that experience. But imagine if I never got started. Imagine if I just never took the first step to make the podcast. The first podcast that I started was The Marketing Woman. It still exists. But when I first started it, I remember I planned it for over 4 or 3 years. And I had multiple drafts. And when I go back and listen to it, I think, hey, this is good. This is a good starting point. Why didn't I just release it in 2021? Even now, when I look back, I think of myself that way. And I don't think, oh, this is, bad. I'm so glad I didn't release it. That's not the thought process that I have, because I think the first step, the first video, the first podcast episode, the first job, the first everything that makes you feel uncomfortable is going to look bad to you, but everybody knows that's the process. It's like trying to learn how to drive a car. You don't exactly become Max Verstappen the first time you start driving a car. If you're not an F1 fan, I'm sorry about that reference. I think you need to get started, right? At some point, you have to start and you have to see it through and not overthink anything, because when you have momentum, you sort of figure things out on the go. I 100% accept that planning and goal setting is so important, but they can become a crutch and they can actually stop us from just doing. And I also think, coming from someone that is actually a type A personality, who loves planning, who has systems in place for every single thing, when I started planning for this new year, I felt sick and I couldn't tolerate that, because I had a couple of goals and they were all timeline based. When I felt sick, it felt like everything had just come down, that I just ruined everything. But then I had to remind myself, it's okay. Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And that quote has just helped me so much in life, and I hope it does to you too, because the real world doesn't always stick to our scripts, and there's only so much we can plan for. And sometimes the most valuable lessons and solutions arise from these challenges we encounter along the way. I have definitely realized that you can plan, but sometimes something even better happens. And that might not seem like the case at the time, but trust me, it is. Now let's get into what neuroscience talks about this, because you know me and I love neuroscience. I talked about how when you start setting goals and, when you start making these plans, that it gives you dopamine, which is the feel-good neurotransmitter. If you think about how often you've started planning projects and then you don't feel that excitement anymore, and that's because neuroplasticity, right? Your brain's ability to adapt and rewire itself. What happens there is when you start planning like this, never go back to it, and then planning again, and then never going back to it again, it sort of becomes used to that. But when you start a project, you start planning, you have the dopamine, good. You actually immediately get into action, and then you see some sort of a result, and then you again work on it. It's like doing a push-up. The first time you do it, you don't feel anything. The second time you do it, you might not feel a lot. The third time, it's going to hurt. Fourth time, it's going to hurt. But then as you keep doing it, your neural pathways will adapt to that. So engaging in goal-oriented activities can strengthen your neural pathways and also sort of enhance your cognitive abilities, right? Creativity, problem solving, critical thinking, all of these things take practice. And that's why people do practice tests. That's why people take practice interviews, because you need to, it's like training. It's like training your body. It's like working out. You have to train your mind to do something and to adapt and rewire itself. And that's what neuroplasticity does. So I'm going to give you 3 things that I've tried and that has worked for me, again, coming from someone who loves planning. And I have sort of escaped this whole planning thing. So I want to share that with you. Number 1, start small. You have to break down your goals into smaller steps. This way, A, it doesn't seem that daunting. B, it's more manageable. And C, it gives you that push, gives you that momentum. For example, when I started this podcast, I told myself, I am just going to start. I'm going to release 5 episodes and stick to it, and then we'll see where it goes. But obviously, my target is not that. That's not my biggest goal. My biggest goal is something else. But to me, starting off with 5 to 6 episodes didn't seem that daunting. And it never seems that daunting to me. I always tell myself one step at a time. I used to have bi-weekly release dates for this podcast before, but now I do weekly because I gave myself enough time to adjust to this change. So start small. The second thing is the obvious one. Visualize your success. Your brain actually doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's not. Try and create a fake scenario in your head right now. Imagine the best thing that you've wanted for yourself and it has happened. Just take a second to look at how happy that makes you feel. But why? Chemical reaction. Why is it happening? That's because your brain actually doesn't know how to differentiate these two. So when you start using the visualization technique and start imagining that you are already performing all of the things that you wanted to do and you're becoming the person you're supposed to be. It fortifies your commitment to your goals. So start to visualize your success. Number 3 is flexibility and feedback. One of the things that happens when we start planning, over planning especially, is we think that I have step A, step B, step C. I have to do only step A, step B, step C, and then something else happens, and then step B gets broken down into 2 parts. And it's hard for people that want to control situations, but it's hard for people like that to adapt to that situation. So, like I said, when I started out this year, I had timeline goals, and I had to become flexible. And that actually made me more excited to work toward my goals than I probably would have if I had just tried to control everything. So flexibility helps you to stay adaptable and also resilient, especially when things don't go as planned. And with the feedback part, always try to have a monthly feedback or review session with yourself. Just write down things. What have I learned this month? What has been the key theme of this month, right? For me, I did this last year and it taught me a lot. And I'm definitely going to do this year. What I sort of do is look back on career, personal development, health, mental wellness, learning, or any other things that I want to do. And then I think about, cool, so what has happened, in these areas of my life this month? What has been the main theme? What is the biggest takeaway from this month? What can I work on? And how am I going to work on it next month? It's simple, and it gives you sort of a clarity when you start to write monthly goals. If you do that, it helps you write your monthly goals. So before we end this episode, I do want to say 2 of my favorite quotes that have stuck with me throughout the years, and I would love to share that with you. I already said the first one, which is, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And the second is, inaction breeds doubt and fear. Action breeds confidence and courage. And it's a quote by Dale Carnegie. Both remind us that action is important and you have to be adaptable. And flexibility is really important. So let's recap whatever we talked about. Stop over planning. Remember that you have to train your neural pathways to become goal oriented. Number 3, start small. Start to visualize your success. Be flexible. Regularly review your goals. Remember these quotes. And that's all for today's episode. Go grab a cup of lemon water, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.